This session will be dedicated to the composers. Da, 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 da. And, well, everyone is coming in now. There are some seats here in the front, actually, that I noticed were not occupied. So if there's someone in the back who would just want to come up front, please do. At least here are 3 seats. And, yeah, I would rather have you come closer, so these are not empty. There come. Da, da, da. Great. Sit here. Yeah. You can sit here in the front row, Annelies. It's free. Yeah. It's great. Great, 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 great. Okay. So we're going to start now with JÜRI, as he was the last one to speak in the libretto session, and will now initiate this session on composing opera and music drama in the 21st century, which is, I think, quite appropriate that he makes this bridge over to this session. JÜRI, I will skip the introduction as we've already gone through that. I just said so. Yeah, that was an apology for the misleading announcement that there was coffee. There wasn't any, and I know this must have been a terrible disappointment. So there will be coffee and sweets in the next break.
We used the computer right almost in the beginning. We show a really tiny bit of comic Peer Gynt actually now, which comes from a scene which takes place during the night, and it's a night funeral, and there is only choir and tape with nightingales. So
there's no visual, no.
Yes. There appears something on the screen, but it doesn't move. So we just have a look on it first, and then I continue actually where I left in my last session.
This is the Peer Gynt you're composing for the Norwegian National Opera.
Is all very lightweight. It's just done for the website, but it has something to do what I like to tell later.
Right.
Night Funeral. So this scene will take place immediately when Per returns to Norway, and there is only humming chorus and tape, which I've always used as a part of my works. The reason why I decided to show it is when I, as a composer, start working, I always start working from an element which exists both in music and in text. Somehow I cannot start from somewhere else. Now the problem is Ibsen doesn't provide me one. And so all this idea of nightingales, what will become quite a major point even in libretto of the first act, I took up myself. And this stage is exactly where I start actually writing the opera. I have an element which is both in music and in text. In Perch, I had a similar story with another animal, yes, the cicadas, or how you call it? Cicada, no? And how, and it was likewise an element which didn't exist in Sophie's any book or something, but we needed something which is part of the libretto and part of the music. What I, in general, keep very important when I'm writing music for opera is very first thing is friendliness towards vocals. To be unfriendly towards a vocalist, it's something I just don't want to do, and it's what I consider a bad thing to do, because it's question of vocalists' bodies and their voice and their careers, and I just don't want to take responsibility over this. Another very important thing for me is speech and language, so that I use speech or spoken text, sung text, as clear as possible, so that it is, again, very friendly for the vocal. Another thing what is really important, we shortly mentioned this, is how to predict the acting of singers. And this is something what you do not as a librettist but as a composer. How you rhythm the sentences and what you put in between the sentences. If you put there something, say it so, something very dark, you know the singers will react to this one way. If you put there something lightweight, they will act in a different way. But this is something I'm all the time trying to predict what the singers possibly will be doing. And at the same time, I try to recreate the role, how the singer possibly sees the role through those rhythms what I write into the music. So it is kind of like a domino effect for me. One thing starts, the fallout of all those other elements which I try to take into the consideration when I'm writing. What is a big challenge for a composer, at least for me, is with operas, is this huge friction between macro level, which is the opera, but you're all the time working with microscopical elements. You're all the time starting to decide what the flute does, what the alto flute does, where the sontinos will they be there? But at the same time, you come very, very blind when writing an opera. You almost drown in the middle of those microscopical elements. And the biggest, perhaps one of the biggest challenges, at least for me, is try to keep the macroscopical level, the main body of both acts, still visible to me, so that I don't lose just my sight to this. I don't know if people, outside composers, or at least this is what my experience has been, that opera becomes, in the life when writing it to a composer, hugely massive project. It just sucks up all your life around you, and as I mentioned before, you almost lose the sights towards the opera, and when you are working with all those strings and divises and whatever tiny elements they are, this is a big thing. What I consider one of the main problems writing an opera is actually the shadow of the past. And I kind of feel that we composers try to avoid this shadow by saying that it doesn't exist, but at the same time, at least I tend to think that when we enter an opera house with a modern opera, we immediately kind of compete with Puccini and Verdi. And this is actually a much bigger question, I think, than what we actually speak about that. At least this is my perception. Opera culture, as it is now, is formed in late 19th century, beginning of 20th, at the time when people's musical perception was very different from ours. We have been spoiled now by this everywhere existing musical material. When, again, this culture which we kind of lead on step into this, we come from a different world, and they formed this culture in a world where going to opera was a big, big happening. Already listening to music was a special occasion in life. And this kind of thing that at least I perceive that there is no difference in opera culture, but the people, the audience is completely different. And this is one of the major themes for a composer, how to do. I can tell one example, for instance, where I can see it. I orchestrate for operas very differently than to other symphonic music, because nowadays people are so used to hi-fi CD players and computers that this sound which comes through many, many angles from this one pit, it just doesn't give the same effect anymore to the people what it did, for instance, during Wagnerian times, when pretty much the same orchestra was also constructed. I take this into consideration usually, and I use very, very different colors in opera theater work. And then comes the premiere, which is really, really bad thing actually for the composer, because this is the curse of the composer. He finally sees how his baby is torn apart in front of all those people, and not worse even is that you will be hung up for all the misdemeanors what there happens. I had a comment actually back then that, for instance, when you have feeling that you could have shortened it up a little, or you could have done this or this might also become, and very often comes also not because of composer or librettist, but it comes from bad directing, bad performings, and so on. But composer will be the one who is hung up and blamed for. So have mercy on us. That's.
All right. Thank you, Jüri. That was very good. Next up is Katharina Backman. Is it? Yes, this is the line. Okay. I thought it was. No, we switched. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. My fault. You switched places. Next up is Carl UNANDER-SCHARIN with his technological opera. Carl has actually worked, he's a high lyric tenor and has sung a lot at the Stockholm Opera, amongst other things. I'm not going to go into the whole bio here. And still active as a singer, mainly sings oratorio parts nowadays. And he's also a professor at the Royal Technical College, Kungliga Tekniska.
Stockholm University of Opera.
Stockholm University of Opera. Yeah. Okay, but he's doing a project there that is very technological, called Extended Opera or Extending Opera, where he uses all sorts of equipment, like, for instance, throat 1, 2, and 3, whatever that is. And I think we will find out just about now. Actually, Carl said, I saw on his webpage that he said in 1998 that electronics in vocal music and opera are imperative. So we're expecting a lot here.
Okay,
go for it.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all say that thank you for that great presentation. I am and have been using technology very, very much in my work, a very collaborative work together with some people here. Not the least Åsa, my wife and co-creator, and singers, Staffan and Maria, and also Alexandra, always together with people, constructors, technicians, other composers, librettists, and of course the whole apparatus behind an operatic production. I am using technology in a dramatic sense. So I found out quite a long time ago that there are certain subjects where we as human beings in the operatic context can where technology can have a meaning, not for its own sake, because I actually hate computers on my own, but I've been spending so much time with them and trying to make them do what I want them to. And so I'm not a technology lover, but I am a technology user in an operatic context. So what I will do now is to give a presentation which is about 15 minutes long, which will give you some sort of hinges on what I and my collaborators have been doing. So this is me. That is me in the olden days. This is exactly the quote you gave us. Wasn't that great? That's where I work and that's where I study. So in my late 40s, I started to do a PhD project. So I'm writing a dissertation at the same time as I am a professor and I'm teaching these youngsters. They are only some 5 or 10 years younger than I. So what I'm into is artistic research. But let's just skip that subject for now because that's a whole symposium on its own. It all started up with a piece of mine that I wrote in '96, which was co-written. The libretto was co-written by me and Nils, actually, who staged it greatly. I will not play anything from this because it's so long time ago, but it actually put my ears on this thing with technology in an operatic context, because that's an opera based on a true story on a person who was schizophrenic, and who actually how to in a musical context have his inner voices gestaltade, put on the stage. That was a very hard task. And at that point I realized, so he had a little mic on his own, and I composed the discussions with him and his doctor sort of on different levels. So when he was actually hallucinating, that was more or less processed on stage and by computers. But when he was giving the answers that that the doctor wanted, then he was singing in a sort of non-processed way. It worked very well, I would say, in a dramatic sense. So, but this is, now I'm jumping into my more current project. This is robotic Olympia, together with Åsa. This is when I'm performing with the MIDI harp. I will give you a little glimpse of that later on. This is an interactive tree, Ombra Mai Fu. All of you opera people, you know that is a strange aria about a shadow. And we decided to build that shadow in an interactive tree. This is Maria, who is sitting here, who is performing with the interactive thing. She's performing Lasciatemi morire by Monteverdi. And all accompaniment is done by her, the movements of her limbs. I will give you a little something for that. And this is from The Elephant Man, which I very soon will tell you about, an opera of mine. And that is when I am performing with this instrument, the throat. And the whole thing of this, look at that. This is Håkan Starkenberg, a Swedish high tenor. And he is actually performing as the Elephant Man. And I was given or offered a commission from Norrlandsoperan, from Magnus Aspegren. And he had seen that old movie on the Elephant Man. I think this is 3 or 4 years ago. And he called me and he said, what about an opera on this theme? And I said, well, that's a great idea, but it is more or less impossible, because this fellow, as I already then knew, Mr. Joseph Merrick, he was not only disformed or handicapped bodily, he also had a very unworking voice, a disformed voice due to his handicap. And how to write an opera based on such a tragic life? I mean, that's a complete motsägelse. Contradiction. So, and I had been developing 2 versions of this throat thing. So I wanted to develop a 3rd version, and I teamed up with a fellow called Ludwig Elblaus, whom I met at the course at KTH. And we decided to forward these throat ideas into a much better instrument, given that the computers now are so much better if you really can master them. So now I will play you a sort of 3 and 30-minute long film, parts of Elephant Man things with Håkan, and parts from the development process, and also from another piece, Artificial Body Voices, which is a dance work where I was performing with the throat. So let's hope we have sound. Could you turn down the light, please? So I wanted to give him interactive gurgle and coughing and mucus. What I didn't say is that every sound you heard from the vocal parts here, both when I was singing and when Håkan was singing, were processed via, of course, computers, but modified by the movements of the hand. And, of course, if you have seen pictures of Joseph Merrigan, you see here, he has this enormous right hand. So that was an artistic idea of having a metaphor for this hand that he was actually in the 19th century showing to an audience in order to make a living, and to have a metaphor of the singer who is actually showing his voice and on his persona on stage in order to attract his audience. So that's why we used only hand movements, but we are now forwarding this instrument into a fourth generation. We were using a larger interface.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Can I make a question here?
Please do.
Is it acoustic and electronic together?
Exactly. So I mean, this is designed for operatic singers who are sort of on stage in a dramaturgic context, singing in a normal way, but where we can add chords or mucus or coughing, things that you couldn't ask. I wouldn't ask a singer to cough on stage, something like that. I wouldn't do that. But so yes, it's acoustic singing. So this is the first version and second version, and you saw the third version in a very prototypey stage. So let's see what happened now. Yes, and we are actually developing yeah. And here you see Ludwig, and this is a student, an American girl who was studying with us at the Operahögskolan last year, and we were actually creating a version with so basically the same idea. She was very happy there, and this is basically the same idea that you can forward chords with something, and of course the iPhone has a gyroscope in it. So we actually did build a version of this instrument when you could carry a micro a iPhone here and a loudspeaker here, and you can walk around and sing your own accompaniment without a pianist or so on. So that's sort of an emancipatory idea behind these things. I'll give you a very short clip. No, I had taken that out. So this is, but I will now play you some Monteverdi with Maria sitting here. So one of the key things here that I think is very interesting to develop further is the idea of having the singer accompany themselves with movement, for instance, in this case. So let me just play this one for you. And this is here, however, the accompaniment is from a synthesizer and not from the voice, but completely played by her. Yeah. Well done. Yeah. Can you hear? I think it was a bit. Is it okay? Yeah. So I will not play an example here, but I will just tell you that we have been also working with a larger bodily instrument, which was actually built during Jonas's, who actually had me as a composer in residence, together with two other composing singers in Copenhagen in 2004. So, and then I wanted to build an instrument, a large body interface, also to be able to accompany myself when singing and leaning and stretching on wires. And as I'm a little bit short of time, I think I will jump this video. But we are actually right now in the middle of a production that will have its premiere in just a little bit more than a month in the Reactor Hall in Stockholm, where we are rebuilding this instrument and making it into a duetto instrument. So it has 8 wires. Now we're giving it 4 wires each to 2 singers who are accompanying themselves and the other singer in a sort of rather interesting bodily choreographed piece. I will jump that now. I also want to present a series of interactive operatic works that Åsa and I have been creating during the last 15 years. And I will play just a 2-minute film showing you short examples of these works that are, as you see buzzwords from the operatic universe, and actually some word Robosyn, which is actually from the Tchaikovsky Swan Lake. But you see Monteverdi, you see, well, that is not opera, but Pearl Fisher's Petrushka is another ballet. Olympia is, of course, Erzählung in Hoffmann. And then we have, after that, a little. So, and these works have been shown in various places. And the idea is, of course, to use our technology-conditioned age, as we all live sort of more or less integrated with technology in our lives, and to use that fact in an artistic universe. So that was, in short, a lot of...
So. Great. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Hello. Next up is Katharina Backman, who is a composer. She has a special affinity for self-made instruments of glass and plays the accordion marvelously. I looked at some YouTube clips. and she has a special interest in Maurizio Kagel, we discovered. So I'm very interested in hearing her viewpoint. She has written many operas, among others for the Stockholm Opera and the Malmö Opera. And she has also been the artistic director of the Nordic Music Days Festival, Composer Festival here in Stockholm in 2012. So now the word is yours.
Thank you. My professional job as a composer and band leader was in a vaudeville show, touring around in the south of Sweden. I had a background studying both classical and jazz piano, but this was my first experience of, and in one way also my education in performing arts. What I learned from this tradition of circus and variety was a total awareness of your presence on stage. You dress swell, you get a nice presentation, you enter and perform your act you might have been practiced for years and years. You communicate with the audience all the time. You are there for the audience, and you are not whatsoever private on stage. This is, of course, normal for every performing artist, whether you dance or sing a part in an opera, but not for musicians. After 10 years of summer touring with the variety artists, I ended up in the composition class at the Vadstena-Akademien of Music. It was a wonderful time. I went to these fantastic concerts with the contemporary music that filled me up completely. But one thing struck me, and that was how some of the musicians behaved on stage, or maybe their lack of behavior on stage. With my background in the vaudeville scene, I found this circumstance quite peculiar. I often caught myself during the concerts in different odd fantasies about the members of these orchestras. I noticed how all the private and unintentional stuff they were doing was in a way enlarged on stage. Why are they wearing these clothes? What does he think when he watches her like that? Why does she keep that ugly handbag beside her chair? Why do they run in and out between the pieces when it's not necessary? These fantastic musicians sat in front of me on the stage, taking really good care of my ears most of the time, but seemed to have totally forgotten that I possessed a pair of eyes as well. The composition studies led me, however, into a world of composers working with instrumental music and musicians in another way. I discovered the works of Luciano Berio, György Ligeti, Alfred Schnittke, and of course Mauricio Kagel, using the musicians in extended performing situations with odd instruments and sound sources, doing strange gestures, sometimes acting bizarre. And there somewhere I found a connection between the sideshows and the Western contemporary art music that I had been searching for, the dramatic situation that you cannot explain. I'm thinking of one of Sofia Gubaidulina's cello concertos, where the celloist suddenly starts to shake a flexatone, quite wild and heavily, looking up through the ceiling and out in the universe, standing on the floor all alone. The scene is very odd and strongly emotional. At the same time, you wonder, why is the soloist doing this? But it's some kind of human behavior that is beyond everyday life, and you get the sense of the whole mankind's presence on earth, so strong and yet so fragile. 1.5 years ago, I was at a concert with a Swedish group of composers and sound artists called Syntjuntan. One of them, Ann Rosén, had made a piece where 5 electric guitarists were sitting in a row on the left side of the stage, and on the opposite side there were 5 persons in much too large knitted caps. The music started, and the guitar players, all men, had music stands in front of them. Lots of pedals and sound equipment all over the floor, playing their parts concentrated and seriously. The knitted caps in the piece were constructed with oscillators, resistances, and leading material. Suddenly the women rose up and started to squeeze their caps hard, producing a wild noise. This went on through the piece, and the interaction between the two groups of people was very puzzling and absolutely fascinating to follow. I understood that the dramatic effect was in many ways unintentional, but I felt afterwards that I really would like to work like this with music drama or opera. You start the whole production with the composition of the music and the musicians on stage. When the music is partly composed and rehearsed, the librettist gets an audiovisual music performance as a trigger to fantasize, to dream, to invent a story out of. This music performance is the abstract synopsis, and the story comes out of it. The words to the arias and ensembles, the sung monologues and dialogues are coming next. And so the music composition and text writing continues until the work is complete. This gives the opportunity to think differently in aspects of both text and tone. It opens up to artists that might not look upon the great opera houses as their natural environment. My vision is that you are free to create something from another point of view, but still have the great privilege of using the words sung by the voice to clarify and to gentle hold you by the hand while traveling into the beautiful and strange world of opera and music drama, live on stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharina.
You can move that.
Go up.
Thank you, Katharina. Next up is Daniel Bjarnason. You have your stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah. Daniel is an Icelandic composer and conductor. He has conducted a lot at the Icelandic Opera and the Icelandic Symphony Orchestra also. Daniel has won numerous awards for his compositions. The Icelandic Music Awards for Composer of the Year last year and this year for the Best Composition and Film Music. Also, he has also had his work performed by great orchestras abroad. Most notably, just last month, there was a performance of a new piece where it was Dúramel conducting in New York.
No, but that's actually in December.
It's in December. Sorry,
It's,
I'm going reading the wrong month. Next December, that's coming up, where
Yeah.
Dúramel is conducting with the LA Philharmonic in a new piece by Daniel. And he just came from also Australia, where he was doing a great work with Ben Frost, another composer, on music to a new music score actually to Solaris, the Tarkovsky film, with visual elements also by Brian Eno, if I'm not mistaken. Well, I'm just going to give the word to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Arpik. I'm standing here today as somebody who has worked in opera quite a lot. I've been working more or less on and off in an opera house since 2003, conducted a lot of operas, and I'm just about to begin the journey of actually writing my first opera. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the questions that I think are facing a composer who's making this decision that he wants to write an opera. It's both personal but also in general, and I want to talk mostly about two subjects, which are the relationship between composer and singers, and also the relationship between opera houses and technology, which also has something to do with composers and singers. I'm going to start by telling you a little story. A few years ago, I took part in a program at the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden. The program was called Opera Genesis, and it brought together 12 young composers to explore the intricacies of using text, writing music for the stage, and writing for the voice. And I learned a lot of things during these weeks, but probably the most memorable instance was in one session where all the composers were asked to name their favorite vocalists, singers who had inspired them and that they had a special affinity with. Now, each of these young composers named about 2, 3, 4 singers, so it was about 30 or 40 names that were mentioned. And in that group, there was only one opera singer. So, all the other people that were mentioned were pop singers, jazz singers, world music singers, experimental music singers. So we're all these young composers gathered in Covent Garden to talk about the future of opera and think about voices, and nobody thinks about opera singers. And this was a really shocking revelation to me. I thought, if there is a problem with opera today, is this it? In order for a composer to write anything meaningful for the voice, he has to understand and love that voice. He needs to know how it works in different registers and at different dynamics. He needs to be able to try things out with the singer. He needs to have a relationship with him or her. And this is not something that you can learn from a book. So if there is no such connection and there is no relationship, then how can the composer write for this voice? For me, the problem is partly cultural, but it's also rooted in the conservatories and music schools, where training of singers is usually very firmly placed within the traditional repertoire. And oftentimes neither singing students nor their teachers really like to come anywhere near music written after 1950, except maybe the occasional Britten or Bernstein. And in the same way, composers are not really taught to interact with singers, and when they finally end up writing something for the voice, they often tend to treat it very academically. They say, yeah, we have a soprano and she can sing from this note to that note. And that doesn't make any sense. But, of course, thankfully, there are many exceptions to this situation. And despite sounding negative, I'm actually quite optimistic about the situation today, more than I was probably a few years ago. I feel that in the last few years, there are more and more operas being written where I feel that this connection between the singer and composer has really taken place, music that is beautifully written for the voice. There seems to be a coming together of the composer and the singer to some degree today, I feel. Just to name a few in recent literature, we have roles that are very specific, like stratospheric soprano of Ariel in Thomas Addis's The Tempest. We have the beautiful sort of floating vocal lines of Kaya Sariaho. A recent masterpiece that I think is George Benjamin's Written on Skin. I don't know if any of you managed to see that. But just to name a few pieces that I think create something very personal, unique, and completely convincing, while at the same time being very much of this time, and where this treatment of the singer is very well handled, I think. So for a composer who wants to write an opera, I think this is one of the most basic questions that you have to start with is, do you love the voice? Do you love opera singers? Do you even like opera singers? I mean, what is the voice that inspires you to write music? And if you decide to write an opera without opera singers, is it still an opera? Or does it become music theater? And does it then not belong in an opera house anymore? And does this distinction even matter? The voice of an opera singer is a highly developed instrument. They're trained to sing in a way that will cut through a rather large orchestra and generate enough sound to fill a large space. So the idea of amplifying the voice seems to run contrary to this idea, and it's almost sacrilegious in the minds of many opera singers and opera lovers. Yet we are moving into a time where electricity, and I use that in a very broad sense, is becoming a larger and larger part of our music making. Composers are mixing live sounds with processed sounds, as we could see just now, or even live processing of sounds. And acoustic instruments are being integrated with electronic sounds in a very organic way. Symphony orchestras and opera houses have mostly resisted this trend up until now. And when it does happen, it seems to be very difficult, and certain orchestral musicians will get very annoyed by it. And this is the kind of thinking that we need to get away from, I think. Just a week ago, the English National Opera premiered a new opera called Sunken Garden by the Dutch composer Michel van der Aa. I don't know if anybody managed to see that. It was just opened a week ago. I haven't seen it. But it employs amplification of both voice and orchestra, as well as playback from tape or computer. And it uses 3D film as an essential part of its staging. So at some point, the audience is asked to put on 3D glasses. And a big part of the score is conducted to a click track in order to make it sync up with the film on stage. Now, this production was hyped up quite a lot before the premiere, but the reception of the critics and the audiences has been very mixed. Part of the problem seems to be that everyone is concerned about whether this is the future of opera or not. Some people are not even sure if it is an opera. Like I said, I haven't seen it, but I've been following the discussions it's generated online, and I find it very interesting how many people and critics become very edgy and irritated as soon as they're confronted by something that doesn't conform to a certain standardized view of how an opera should be put together. And how dare they call this an opera? Well, for me, it's something that we really shouldn't worry about, is whether it's the future or not, because it's actually the present, and it's a natural evolvement of an art form, I think. Opera should change, and it should evolve, and it always has. I don't think every opera in the future will use 3D, but I'm sure some of them will. And the opera houses and opera companies need to be ready to be flexible enough to make all these different kinds of opera. And the singers and the orchestras must be flexible too. Purely acoustic music is a beautiful thing, and I hope we will always have it. But nevertheless, it's my prediction that in the future, the classical establishments, the orchestras and the opera houses will have to start dealing with electricity as a fact of life. And if they don't, I think they will simply lose the next generations of composers that might want to write for this medium. As I see it, looking into the future, there should be a broad mix of expression and techniques. So there will be composers who still want to write completely acoustic music with no amplification or electronics. Some will want to mix electronics in a subtle way, like Kaya Sariaho does in L'amour de loin, where she mixes the electronics seamlessly into the orchestral sound. And then there will be some composers who will want to just go all in and have everything amplified, including the voice. And the answer to all of these should be yes. If we want the art form to develop, and if we want the best of future composers to be interested in it, then this must all be possible. We must not limit ourselves to some preconceived narrow idea of what opera should be. We don't need to reinvent anything. We just need to make space for things to evolve as they will. And if some people don't want to call it opera, then that's just fine. They can call it whatever they want. Just the last quick point I want to make, and that is, this has been touched upon a little bit today, but I think it is essential that those who want to write opera or music theater, whatever it is, make themselves acquainted with the theater. They need to have an understanding of the process that is staging an opera. And they have to understand that there are a myriad of factors involved and that the X factors are actually too many to count. And not only must they understand this, but they must, in a sense, embrace it. In the same way that they need to love the voice, they should also love the theater with all its sweaty compromise. So.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Daniel.